Hey y'all, today we have a part 2 of our first episode with Dr. Devin Effinger. He is a good friend from high school and now a neuroscientist. And in this episode, he shares his story of addiction and recovery, being a dad in recovery, and all the amazing things. Tune in. Welcome to Impacting Recovery, Uncensored. I'm your host, Sarah Pritchard. This is a podcast where we dive deep into the real, uncensored truths about addiction, recovery, and everything in between. No sugarcoating, no judgment, just honest conversations that can help lift up the solution. So let's get started. Today, we are doing our part 2 episode with Dr. Devin Effinger. How are you, Devin?
Great.
Good.
Yeah.
If you guys have not seen the part 1, you definitely should go check it out. Devin is a neuroscientist, and we talked a lot about the brain and addiction and the chemical process of that and all sorts of fun facts.
Psychedelics.
Psychedelics. Yeah. So go check it out. And so I wanted to do kind of a part 2 episode so we can learn more about Devin and just how you got into this. And, I know bits and pieces of your recovery story since we've known each other since high school. But I know it's very powerful. So I wanted to learn more. And I think your experience just in the recovery side of things is going to be so beneficial for so many people. And so many people are going to be able to relate. So if you're good with that.
Yeah, for sure. Let's
okay.
go.
So you grew up in Colorado, correct?
Yeah. So I was born in Colorado and moved to Atlanta when I was like 10. So I sort of grew up, did all the firsts in Atlanta as far as drugs and all that stuff. But.
Yeah. And it's funny, I was just asking you about your hat, and it's a brand that I don't know, and it's skateboarding and snowboarding.
Yeah, it's a Volcom. I mean, it's like a loose action sports type of a lot of people.
Yeah. So you grew up you loved skateboarding, snowboarding, doing all that.
Yeah. So I think for me, the earlier years of my life were pretty tumultuous. My parents were never married. My earliest memories are of I think I was 5. My parents were fighting, and mom got in my dad's face. Dad kind of pushed her back, and she fell over the couch. And I think at 5 somehow I'd been programmed to when something's wrong, you call the police. Little narc. So I called the police, and my mom ended up being the one who was seen as the instigator, and that, basically she was angry that I had called the cops, and that sort of set the stage of me thinking that I wasn't good enough.
Yeah.
I look back through all the work I've done in recovery and realized that at that moment I was trying to help, and I was basically told and internalized what her response is, you didn't do this right. You're not good enough.
Yeah.
Basically, And so, for me, skateboarding in those early years was my first true love, but also my first, external solution to the emerging internal problem.
Yeah.
It's if my whole value is wrapped up in how good I was at skateboarding.
So how old were you when you had your first substance or sip of alcohol, whatever?
So I think I was 12 years old when I first tried a little bit of alcohol, and quite, honestly, the early days, the very first few times that I drank or even the first time I smoked weed, it didn't really do much.
Mm-hmm.
Some people talk about they blacked out the first time and fell in love. For me, it was didn't do a whole lot in the very beginning.
Right.
I think it wasn't until I was 14 or so, 13 or 14, that I really experienced the relief that came from hitting the sweet spot.
Yeah.
And I was, prior to that, at that age, at least I started to become hyper aware of the fact that other people were having their own sort of thought life, and that potentially they were thinking about me.
Yeah.
And probably they were not thinking good things about
Yeah.
me. So it becomes this Truman Show type of all of a sudden everything, it's I'm in this reality show, and everyone's judging me, and don't say something stupid, And so at that point, like if there was a girl I liked, I'd be like, I want to go talk to her. And then as soon as she would look at me, I'd be like, oh, look at the ground. Like, don't say anything stupid, you know?
Yeah.
And then that same voice would be like, well, why didn't you go say something? Like, what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
You know? And that night I drank enough alcohol that when I looked across the room at a girl I had a crush on, there was no voice that said to look at the ground. And instead I like walked up to her and said some of the coolest things I had said to a human being in my life,
Yeah.
you know? And like we like made out or whatever, you know? And like that was like, so for me, that was like the early days, but like right sort of getting into the teenage years, I had that experience that was sort of like this aha, like I'd been lost at sea and I finally found land type of moment.
Yeah. Was it alcohol or was it weed or both?
Initially it was alcohol.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so where does that tie into, I know you had some pretty traumatic stuff happen when you were, I don't know what age is, but an accident, a horrific situation with a friend.
Yeah.
Do you mind sharing?
No,
on
not
this?
at all. So basically I'm 13. I've found this new social lubricant, and this what I didn't know then that I know now is that alcohol was simply just quieting the fear.
Yeah.
Right. I had maybe an overactive amygdala, and the alcohol was quieting it down, or whatever the case. You know.
You didn't know that at 13?
I didn't know that my amygdala was hyperactive. But looking back, that's probably what was going on. And like, but that basically like all it was doing was quieting the fear, and it was allowing me to just be who I am.
Mm-hmm.
All I knew is I drink alcohol, I become this cool person.
Yeah.
And it's like this magic, and basically like sort of decided at that moment that I want to do this. I want to be a little bit buzzed for the rest of my life, every single day.
Yeah.
You know, I was never like a binge drinker. It's like I just want to be like, I want to be at the sweet spot forever.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was like my introduction. At 15, a friend of mine that I grew up with in my neighborhood, we had been drinking and smoking weed, and we were walking in our neighborhood, and we see these kids on a go-kart, and we sort of flag them down like, hey, let us take your go-kart for a spin or whatever. And so they begrudgingly let us take the go-kart, and we kind of go around the corner, and we're like going down the straightaway. I'm riding shotgun. My buddy John was driving, and like he was going to take the first lap, and we basically, it's like a quarter mile or maybe a half mile straight away. So we're going like 30 miles an hour, and it basically comes to a T. And I just remember like we're approaching the T, and I'm like feeling like we should probably slow down, you know? And I look over, and he's like trying to stop it. It's not stopping.
Oh my gosh.
And basically what happened is he tried to like make a right, and the go-kart like went up on two wheels. So he like corrected, and it slammed down and came up on the other two wheels, which caused me to be like hanging out of the go-kart. And basically we like went into the woods, and there are telephone poles with like a metal wire that hangs like this, and that wire like hit me right in the face.
Oh my gosh.
And it shattered my cheekbone, cracked my eye socket. I had a traumatic brain injury. I was unconscious. So that was intense. So I was 15 years old, and basically like I was having issues with my speech.
Mm-hmm.
I was really like volatile emotions. Like I was all over the place. Confusion. Like I just had like really kind of persistent effects from the brain injury. And then 3 months later, you know, in the midst of me like trying to recover and sort of work my way back into coming back into school, this would be freshman year of high school, my best friend who I had grown up with, we went to the same middle school. He went to a different high school. He and his mom were tied up and murdered in their house. And so that was, I think it was like I say a perfect storm. Obviously it's not, it's terrible, but basically I think the 1-2 of those two events in succession basically led me to develop a different relationship with alcohol and drugs.
Yeah.
I sort of, that, and I was prescribed opiate pain medication for that following that injury.
Yeah.
And so I basically learned that these drugs allowed me to not have to feel the way that I felt inside.
Yeah.
And so basically from that point on, I outsourced any discomfort emotionally for until I crashed and burned. Like basically I never had to deal with anything anymore.
Right. So in school, I mean, obviously you're like a genius. So did you struggle in high school with school? Or were you able to pull that off and still like get high and stuff?
So prior to the accident, I probably was going to flunk out because I was just coming to school and like smoking weed before school and just like sleeping.
Yeah.
And drinking a little bit at school. And after the accident, an interesting thing occurred. I was like, prior to that, I was really into drawing and art. And after that accident, I basically never drew ever again. But I started to be very good at math and science.
Crazy.
I don't know if there's anything to that. Like maybe I was always good at math and science and whatever, but that occurred. I was held back. I had to do I was in special ed classes. I was held back, and I basically spent the rest of, maybe call it like the power of the will or the ego. Like I think I worked hard in school because I didn't want to be held back. I wanted to graduate with our class.
Yeah.
You know, so like I had to kind of go into overtime to do that.
Yeah.
But it could be also that, we do know that following, especially at an age like 15, when there's a lot of changes happening in your brain, neuroplasticity is very high. There's so many changes occurring that following brain injury, your brain can kind of go into overdrive to fix areas, provided that the damage isn't too intense. And so it's possible that, I strengthened some part of my brain that would help me be better at math and science. I'm not really sure, but
yeah.
But I did well. I did pretty good, I think, in high school, and I graduated or whatever.
And then college.
And then I went to college. Yeah, I had the Hope Scholarship, so I guess I did pretty good.
Yeah.
And which I think, if I remember, it's pretty easy to get the Hope Scholarship. But
it's like a 3.0. So.
Yeah, pretty ezy. But depending on who you ask,
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Regardless, I did have it, and then Pell Grants or whatever. And I went to Georgia Southern, and
Go Eagles.
Yeah, go Eagles. You did too.
Yeah,
that was an interesting experience because, I think in high school, I don't know if I was popular. Maybe it was more like infamous, but like I had like friends. Like I was like hanging out with people, like people knew who I was. Like it was whatever. And then you go to college and you're like this like small fish in a big pond, you know? And, I alluded to skateboarding being like an external solution to an internal problem. Like I had basically like always used masks. This is all obviously hindsight, but I always needed to like present something to the world because deep down, if you knew who I really was, you wouldn't like me.
Yeah.
So when I get to Georgia Southern, I quickly realized that if you want to like have a social life, and especially like with girls, you got to join a fraternity.
Yeah.
And nothing against fraternities, but just to give a little bit of a backdrop, like growing up in middle school, I would listen. I wore like studded belts. I wore girls like with tight pants, spray painted my skate shoes gold. Listened to the Ramones. Like I was punk rock. You know. Fast forward, 5 years now or whatever, and I'm like joining a fraternity.
Yeah.
So, and my nickname in the fraternity was like Thug Life. I mean, I didn't fully, surrender my identity, but I did like do it or whatever, and it was fun. But I think at that point, like the drinking started to escalate. Though I was sort of like the drug dealer of the fraternity, and I was drinking a bunch. And then I actually ended up getting kicked out of that fraternity. I got into a pretty bad fight with somebody, and they knew that which fraternity I was in, and the national organization kicked me out.
That's not good.
Which wasn't good, but in some ways it was. I was like a legend, and I was still able to go to all the parties or whatever. But
okay,
not for good reason. It's not good what I did, but yeah, that's what happened.
Yeah.
Basically, when I would drinking even early on in high school, even though it was more innocent, always like brought out problematic behavior for me.
Okay, yeah, and because we didn't hang out too much in college, but I would never have guessed that you were the drug dealer of the fraternity, Like I just had no idea. And of course, my alcoholism is progressing at that point too, but it's bizarre.
Yeah. Not all drugs. I think my because there was somebody else that was also selling weed, but my thing was I was selling a lot of mushrooms.
Yeah.
Ironically,
And so after you got kicked out, what did the rest of like your college career look like, and the progression? What did that look like, and where I guess was it when it started to get like really bad?
Yeah. So after that happened, I was put on academic probation. And then I sort of fizzled out and went back home to Atlanta. And I went to Kennesaw State University just to keep it going, you know? And, you know, I was always able to do good, even though, like, I put probably, like, 15% of my effort into school my whole life. I always just was able to do pretty good.
Yeah.
You know, good test taker, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
Terrible student. People hate me. Like, my friends because I'm obviously around a lot of people who are really good students, you know? And I was just not that way. Like, I never studied. I was just a terrible student.
Yeah.
But like, could get good grades or whatever. And then for me, when I went back home, I reconnected with my buddy Kyle, whom I had grown up with. He was in the grade below us. And we both grew up skateboarding. So I'd known him since middle school as well. Yeah. And he and I were both home. He was home from UGA, or I think he went to like Athens Tech or something, but he was also home. And so we connected. And that's sort of when we get right kind of back into the drugs more. Like when I was at Georgia Southern, it was more drinking and social, and I was like away from the opiates. Yeah. And then when I came back home, as you know, like where we grew up, there's just a lot of that going on. So we were back to doing, you know, Oxycontin and heroin and all that stuff. And basically, I'm still in school at this time, but one night he and I went out to a bar. Our friend Ian had come home from rehab, and we met him at Tilted Kilt, which is a terrible place to meet your buddy when he gets home from rehab, you know. And
well, let me stop you right there. So when was the first time you tried heroin?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, I mentioned that I had been doing oxys I was prescribed them, and then so it kind of developed a taste, and there was oxys were really easy to get, and it's sort of a natural transition that occurs for everyone. I mean, what ends up happening is you develop a tolerance, which if you want to know more about that, go to episode 1. But you develop a tolerance, and then, I don't know, your morals go out the window, and then you realize you can pay a third of the price for something that'll last 2 times as long. You know, it's like, and you start by snorting it just like you're snorting the oxys, and then eventually, like, the needles came into play and all that stuff. It's just like over time you begin, like I resisted this, you know, shooting it up, but eventually
it got there.
Eventually I was like, whatever, you know.
Yeah. And so was that in high school or college?
That heroin was, heroin wasn't until later. I wasn't doing heroin in high school. Yeah. I was doing oxys, but not heroin.
Right. And then, okay, so y'all get to the Tilted Kilt. Your buddy's out of rehab. Did you think you had a problem? Or were you like, I'm just a partier kind of thing?
Yeah, no, I definitely, so the backstory to that is that Kyle and I had basically made a decision to like stop opiates. Okay. We're going to get sober and just smoke weed. Right. Basically. And so we do that for like 2 weeks, and then buddy comes home. Oh, it's awesome. Let's go to Tilted Kilt, which is like, you know, it's like a bar. It's like Irish Hooters. I don't know what it is, but it's just not a good place to go. You know, and we went there, and, you know, it's a classic example of like, you know, I had a plan. We weren't going there to drink, you know. Yeah. And then as soon as we're there, we noticed that there's a DJ setting up. We asked the bartender, hey, what's going on? Oh, there's a sorority party.
Oh, perfect.
All right, plans have changed, you know? And we end up getting hammered, and, you know, as I alluded to, it gets kind of crazy, and we almost get into fights. I mean, this is just like part of, I don't know why, alcohol later in life evoked like this aggressive part of me. And but anyways, at the end of the night, the bar's closing, everyone has to leave, and we drive home. And the next morning I wake up and I sort of have this realization, like, man, that was so stupid. You know, like what was I doing? Like, why, you know, and just realizing that maybe I have a problem with drinking as well. Like, it's not just the drugs, and the fact that we drove home hammered, like it was just really stupid. And, you know, around this time, it's probably 11 a.m. I get a call from Kyle's mom asking where he is, because usually he was always at my house or I was at his house. I mean, at that point, growing up, we were pretty inseparable, but certainly at that point we were. And then a couple hours later, his uncle called me, and then I knew that basically Kyle had driven home on a road that we grew up driving on and went off the road, and his Jeep flipped, and I guess it was like a brush fire, and basically like burned to death, you know, and like that was basically when I stopped going to school. Like I basically have like, if you look at my transcripts, and I had to deal with this when I was applying to grad school, it's like 5 different universities over the course of 10 years. And there's like some F's and W. I just stopped going.
Yeah.
And basically, I think for me at that point, I kind of just gave up. Like I was like, what's the point of having people that you love because they just die? And like for me, it was like alcohol and drugs were kind of the only dependable form of what felt like connection.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think in my story I take a pretty sharp turn, and it gets pretty dark from that point on.
And so that's just awful. And I understand why, like, it just goes off the deep end after that. So what does it look like those next few months, years, whatever, when you got to the point of, I need help, or people in your life are like, Devin, you need help. We're gonna, what did that look like?
Yeah. So yeah, basically around that time it gets out of control.
Mm-hmm.
I'm basically injecting anything that's water soluble, any powder I can get my hands on. Not that I was like trying to kill myself, but I just didn't care anymore.
Yeah.
I didn't have any reason. I didn't feel like I had any reason to like keep it on the rails.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I mentioned, I dropped out of school, and I kind of just disappeared. I was like, I was living in what I now know was like a crack house. Like it was basically just this apartment with a couple other drug addicts, selling drugs and doing drugs, and my life basically was like this. I always reference Groundhog Day, but nowadays like people in the rooms are too young to get the reference. But my life was like this repeat nightmare.
Yeah.
And I would wake up in the morning, full-blown withdrawals, and I would some days I would decide like I'm not going to do this anymore. So usually it was at the day actually begins the night before, where I either saved a little bit or I didn't.
Yeah.
And if I didn't save a little bit, it's because I really wanted to stop. I at least wanted to take a break.
Yeah.
I would always save a little bit because I knew in the morning I was going to be dope sick, and I had to do a little bit just to tide me over to when I could go downtown to get some more dope.
Right.
On the days where I decided I was going to stop, I would last a couple hours maybe, and then I would change my mind, or so I thought.
Yeah.
And I would be off to the races, and then always like at the end of the day, like the end of the day was always the time in which I had like a moment of clarity, and I would be like act like really considering killing myself. Because I just didn't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
And I knew, after having done this multiple times, I knew that no matter how much I didn't want to tonight, that tomorrow I was going to change my mind.
Yeah.
And
that's so like beautiful how you're laying that out, even though it sounds so awful. But like that is the hopelessness that the true addict and alcoholic suffer from. Is like there is no answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's like a misconception that a lot of people have. It's hard to have empathy for somebody that like continues to lie to you and continues to use, but what's happening behind the scenes is that, at least in my case, and I think your case as well, it's like in those moments, like everything in me wanted to stop.
Yeah.
I didn't want to do this anymore. It's not fun.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that one of those nights, I like sent a message to my dad at like 3 a.m, just like out of my mind,
Yeah.
I should back up a little bit. Basically, what led up to that was like, there was like a 6-month period where I overdosed twice. I was arrested in a bad part of town in downtown Atlanta, and was held in like a holding cell for like 18 hours just because I think they knew if they had put me in general population, it would have been bad for me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got bailed out and just went back to using, and I went downtown. I was downtown in a place that we used to call the Bluffs, just like part of downtown where you can buy drugs easily. And I don't know if that exists anymore, but presume it does. But I was in a parking structure injecting drugs, and I had like heroin and crack in the car, and a cop like pounds on the window. And I mean, he could have been a security guard cop. I don't really know. But regardless, it was a dude that had a gun, like with a badge, and and I'm like mid like act,
Yeah.
you know, and he was for some reason was like just like get the F out of here, you know, like just leave, you know, and so we pull out and I drive like a block away into another parking structure to do what I had to do because there was no way I was going to be able to go home all the way home without like I was just sick. I needed to do it, you know, and that it was that night where the typical suicidal ideation would occur that I was like, what am I doing? You know, like I'm out of control. This is crazy.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, that they call it the gift of desperation. Like I had this moment of clarity where I was willing to send off a text or an email or whatever it was to my dad. You know, and my dad, you know, I alluded to it, or maybe I didn't quite allude to it, but basically he wasn't around the first, you know, several years of I mean, he was, but he just wasn't a huge presence in the first like few years of my life. And at this stage, he's in Colorado. He didn't know what was going on. He thought everything was fine. And so I sent him this message, and it kind of caught him off guard. And that sort of begins the process of me getting into recovery. It initially begins with him sending me like some money. So I was like, I just need some money for gas to drive to Colorado. I just need to get out of here, you know. And he sends me money, and of course, like, I budgeted a little bit for one last hoorah, you know,
right.
and then was gone for like 3 weeks, you know.
Yeah.
And then I reached out again, and I'll never forget this. I reached out again, and he was like, I was like, Dad, can I have some more money, whatever? And he's like, no. He's like, if somebody told you had cancer and the only way to survive would be to leave Atlanta, wouldn't you leave? And I don't even know where the words came from, but I was like, I can't. And I never said I can't. I never viewed it that way.
Yeah.
You know? Like, I think I knew implicitly, like I said, that tomorrow I was going to use again, but like also sort of believed that I was changing my mind every day. I didn't fully comprehend that I can't stop using drugs. I can't. I'm going to die here. Mm-hmm. And that changed everything, where like my stepmom flew out, and they basically like extracted me from Atlanta and brought me back out to Colorado.
And so you are one of the few that never went to a treatment.
Yeah.
And just got immersed in the recovery circles. Yeah,
for better or for worse. I mean, it certainly, like as a parent now, it was risky not to send me to treatment. I don't know, the dynamic between my mother and I is that like I've always sort of been like the man of the house. So especially in those earlier years, like if I said I was fine, I didn't need to go to treatment. Okay, this is what we're doing. You know, she didn't like. She may have had the power, but she didn't feel like she had the power to actually intervene in what I was doing. Mm-hmm. So when I moved out to Colorado, basically I was put into this mountain town where I didn't have any connections, and my stepmother, who actually flew out to come get me, was able to play a really pivotal role in the early recovery because she really held my feet to the fire, and there wasn't like that vulnerability that most mothers have with their child. Mm-hmm. Like she could just be like, no, you know, this is what you're doing,
right?
You know, and set some really strict guidelines. I was living in their house, and they could search my stuff if they wanted to, and like I had to go to this recovery, this 12-step group basically. Mm-hmm. And she had been off of alcohol, she'd been sober for 30 years, and so she knew everybody there. So it was like this little system where like if I didn't show up, she'd get a report, you know, and I would lose my housing or whatever. And that coupled with like I really did want to like stop at that point. I was motivated to stop,
right?
You know.
So the first meeting you went to, did you stop? Were you done, or did it take some time?
No, I did not. It took some time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll never forget the first time I went to one of these meetings, and I just kind of looked around. And I was like, just judging everybody, you know, like this is so stupid,
right?
And like the kumbaya, like first of all, like the mindset I have when I come in here is very selfish and survivalistic, and like always manipulative, right? So it's like, what do you people really want from me?
Yeah.
When are you going to ask for me to sign up to pay $9.99 a month? Like, I'm just waiting for you to like pass me the Kool-Aid or whatever's going to happen here.
Right.
I'm real skeptical about what we're doing here.
Yeah.
You know, I don't believe you actually care about me because why?
Yeah.
I don't care about you.
Yeah.
You know? And so I was like really off put by it at first, you know. And I remember looking at the wall and I see like they had the 12 steps listed out, and I was like, those are the 12 dumbest things I've ever, like the terrible ideas. Why would I want to do any of those things?
Right.
You know, I just need to get a good job, get some money in the bank. I need a hot girlfriend and a nice car, and I'll be fine.
Be set.
Yeah. I don't care about what these people are talking about in here.
Yeah.
You know? So I was really skeptical in the beginning.
Yes. And I think it's so important, and you touched on it, the gift of desperation or the surrender or moment of clarity, all sorts of different wonderful ways to talk about it. But you had that. You had a desperation that you didn't want to be shooting heroin in your car again and having the policeman knock on your window, you know, and just doing that every day. And so do you remember, was there like a particular moment when it just kind of clicked for you? Or was it more of this like gradual, just being uncomfortable, taking action, and your stepmom being very diligent about making sure you're doing all the things?
Yeah, so there was definitely a moment. So basically, my experience from the initial skepticism was like there happened to be somebody there that was talking about, like, it's going to sound weird, but they were talking about smoking crack in a closet naked. Just out of his mind, you know? And like the funny thing is, like, who would have ever guessed that person's experience would save my life? But I heard that and I was like, that's my guy. You know, I believe that man.
Yeah.
I know that dude's been where I've been.
Yeah.
Maybe even farther, because I was never hiding out in a closet naked because, you know, amphetamines weren't my thing.
Right.
But I believed him.
Yeah.
And I knew that he was the real deal. And he was also talking about how these 12 steps had changed his life. And so I believed him. And so that's like what the beauty of these like fellowships is, like people share their experience, strength and hope, not just the strength and hope. Because if you were just out there telling me about how good the steps were, I would have been gone.
Yeah.
But I believed this man, and I was willing to do what you know, give it a shot, you know. And that doesn't mean that I did it perfectly, because I didn't, and I still used again. But basically, that started me along the process where I started to take these steps, you know. And I think my mistake was it was like a la carte, like, okay, well, I'll do this part, but like I'm not gonna do that part. You know, I'll get a sponsor, but like I'm never gonna call him.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll work a 4-step, and this is like relapse.
Yes.
Okay, I'll work a 4-step, but there's like 2 things that like I'm not quite sure the statute of limitations, and I just don't want to. One of them's kind of weird. I don't want to tell you, you know, like things like that, like it's just secrets that I want to keep, you know.
Yeah.
And then this last time, I went like 90 days without, you know, 90 days sober or whatever, and I used again, and it was a bad one. Like I basically got my hands on some cocaine and MDMA. I've injected MDMA. It was crazy. You know, so basically I got back into needles and was shooting drugs. And
I don't even know what MDMA is.
Molly, ecstasy.
Oh, okay.
It's not a typical injectable, but I did, and it was crazy. But anyways, basically what occurred, I like spun out of control. I blew all the money I had saved parking cars in those 90 days because I was doing valet. I crashed my car, and then I had car insurance, so I had a rental car, and in like a crazy drugged out event, I basically crashed the rental car too. And then
brutal. And
then one night I was sort of unsanitary about the storage of my utensils. I'll just say that, like, basically, like I was saving cottons and had the spoon in the same place, and there's like soot on the spoon, and basically I injected some stuff I shouldn't have, and like woke up one morning with like balloon hands and like some gnarly infection. And so at that point, like I hit another bottom. I was in the hospital, and I was like, man, like even when I'm trying to do this, I use again.
Yeah.
And it's like, the difference is I'm still governing what I'm doing here.
Yeah.
I'm not fully submitting to what is being suggested or asked of me. I'm still deciding what's best for myself.
Yeah.
And it's like, so even when I try to do this, if I'm running the show, I use again. And it was that realization that I think was the first step in entirety for me.
Yeah.
because it's like when I came in, I knew I was powerless and I knew my life was unmanageable. Got it. No questions asked. Understood. But what I didn't quite fully understand is that the problem centers in my mind.
Yeah.
That my mind is the problem. That my decision maker, my central processing unit is corrupted,
Yeah.
So all the ideas I have are wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or at least a lot of them.
Yeah.
So it was at that moment that I was like, finally, like, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
If this guy who used to smoke crack naked in a closet tells me to eat a handful of dirt, I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
Because I'm sick of the results I'm getting on my own.
Yes.
And so I did. And that was it for me. I mean, I went through this whole process and so I was finally willing to like do everything that was asked of me.
Yeah. That's incredible. I had a very similar experience with the a la carte, as you said, like taking what I want out of it and what I'll do. And this isn't important, and getting drunk again. And, I did go to treatment and a few little IOPs and detoxes. But when I got sober, it was after a hospital visit.
Yeah.
And I hadn't drank in a whole year. And that was like never happened in my life. And then kind of like when you're same thing, I woke up and I'm like, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Like everything in me knew what I needed to do. And I am a terrible decision maker. I've gotten better over the years. But that was like, you have to go through this whole process and just do it. Because there's pieces that you haven't done. And there were people in my life, not the crack man in the closet, but there were people in my life that drank like me, did things like me, thought like me, and they were living happy, free lives and laughing. And it didn't matter about the external circumstances. Just like you mentioned earlier, like you got to get the job, you got to get the girlfriend, you got to like same. I needed to live here. I needed to have this certain job. I needed to look a certain way, And in that moment, like none of that mattered anymore. And it's funny how you said, like, if he asked me to do dirt, I would. I always say, if my sponsor would have asked me to jump in a lake in 30 degrees, I would have done it because I just didn't care.
Yeah.
And I was so worried about what people thought of me. I was so worried about what people would think of me if I didn't drink, when in reality, they're probably like, thank goodness she's not drinking anymore.
Totally.
So, yeah. Okay, so you start to dive into recovery all in, and then your life just changes.
Yeah.
Takes
so
off.
I think like a couple things I like to mention. So it's like I alluded to, like through this process, like the steps like taught me how to live my life in a completely different way.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're kind of misunderstood and all this stuff, and like that it's like religious and you have to believe in all this stuff. And my experience was like after I had that experience of like, I can't do this. Like nothing in me is sufficient to stop this. I need something to intervene into my life. For me, the hang up was like the God thing, and it's like understandably so. Like all the stuff that happened early on in my life, I didn't even mention, but my stepdad was like a drug addict and he was abusive and he used to like beat me up until I could beat him up, and like all these things that happened, I just felt like I was dealt this like pretty lame card, not as lame as it gets, but not also great, you know? And so it's like, well, why would I turn my life over to God? If there's a God, and that's not even to mention what happened to my buddy and his mom, right? So it's like, well, I don't want anything to do with that God. You know? And luckily, crack man in the closet, whatever, it was like, you don't have to believe in God, bro. If you're willing to take some actions that this program suggests, you'll get the results that I got.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, that's what happened to me, And it's like when I got to that 4-step, when I did this inventory, those 2 little things I wanted to keep to myself, I didn't keep them to myself this time.
Yeah.
And it's like I can't know for sure what made the difference, but certainly not holding on to some secrets that make me feel like I'm not good enough or reinforce the belief that I'm not good enough. Getting rid of those was definitely helpful, you know, and making amends to the people that I'd harmed and like returning the, like I always tell this story of like, when I was a year sober, I was like, metaphorically putting on the armor to go slay the dragon and make my amends in Atlanta. I was living in Colorado at the time. And as I'm packing, I have these amends planned out, and I'm paying back certain people. Mm-hmm. And as I'm packing, I see this watch. And it's a watch that I stole back in the day from a good friend of mine. And like, was immediately overcome with fear, right? Because it's like, there was 2 of them, and it was expensive watches. It's grand larceny. Like, what's going to happen? I have this cool valet job, this stupid, like, I'm afraid to do this. And he was like, we have to go to any length. If you're not willing to go through the fire or face your fears, you're probably going to use again. Yeah. And so, I reached out and it was awkward and in many ways maybe like had persistent effects on the relationship, but like I had to do what was right. I had to give back what I had taken. And the end result was actually much better than I thought. Like this friend's mother was like, thank you so much. She said, you made our holidays. For 8 years, we thought that a family member who was visiting at the time stole the watches.
Wow. And
it's like the beauty there, I mean, first of all, it's terrible. And of course I felt awful.
Yes.
But the beauty there is like when we go back to make these amends, it can have healing effects for people way outside of our little viewpoint.
Right.
And it can also, when you give somebody the opportunity to express how your actions harmed them, it just like changed my life, and really showed me how I had been living my life. Because, people think the drugs and the alcohol are the problem. If I could just stop drinking, that's going to fix everything. But the problem was the way that I was living my life.
Yeah.
The problem was the way that I interpreted reality, and the actions that I took, and the sort of survival strategies that I had adopted that we learn later are character defects, create a life that's so unlivable that I need escape through drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
That's the problem. If I can fix that, then I don't want to drink anymore.
Right.
And so the whole process like completely revolutionized my life, and like has, nowadays when something happens, like my mind is in that sort of inventory mindset of like third column, why does this bother me so much? What's going on? Like what's underneath this anger that I'm feeling?
Yeah.
As opposed to like screaming at somebody and having to make amends to them in 2 years or whatever.
Right. I know. Yeah. Big difference. And so, I mean, and after that, I mean, you just got into, you mentioned it on the first episode, I think, but you got into doing all this work in jail system and nonprofit, and speak to all that stuff.
Yeah. So I think, part of the structure of recovery is that you there's a lot of focus on being of service. Mm-hmm. So doing things to help other people, having a role that you don't get paid for to contribute to a group. And I really dove into helping other people, like becoming a sponsor and walking other men through this process, and like basically taking all these negative things that had happened to me or that I had done and packaging it in a way that makes me relatable to the skeptic that's just like me.
Yeah.
That doesn't want anything to do with this.
Yeah.
That's part of my purpose today. Is like if I can be the crack man in the closet. It's like you never would realize that those things that we did can save somebody's life. It's not that I saved their life. It's that I was relatable enough that they gave this thing a shot. Mm-hmm. And that saved their life, because you have to do the work.
Right.
And so I really developed a taste for helping other people, or a passion. It unlocked some purpose of my life. This is what I'm supposed to do. And so I was like a year sober, and I started to volunteer with this woman that was like going into the jail. And she was at the time teaching this. It was like a Christian-based restorative justice program. And I was just going in to share my story, mm-hmm. And like try to relate. And what ended up happening is I became like the assistant director of this organization, was with them for five years, and like brought a lot of what I learned. Basically it was just her teaching a class, and then we built it into a nonprofit, like built it into a whole thing, and I took a lot of what I learned from recovery and packaged it in a way that inmates could kind of go through the work over the course of 6 weeks, and it was pretty. We even at one point opened up a transitional living facility that was like the premise was it was like a restaurant. With like 5 rooms above. And so graduates of the program would come work at the restaurant, live there, and then leave with rental history and work experience. And
very cool.
But so basically I did that for 5 years. And what would always happen is people would start off like with their arm, like kind of with like this attitude of like, I'm too cool for this. I just want to get out of my cell. Like whatever you're talking, cool, I'm just not going to engage, you know? And over the course of 6 weeks, people would inevitably open up, and it would be this dialogue of people getting real about things that had happened to them, the work that we're doing to like change our perspectives. And over the course of all that time, it became very apparent to me that trauma was the problem here. That like 98% of the people I had worked with had some sort of situation that occurred early in their life that set the stage for negative belief systems and maladaptive behavior patterns like drug use, gang activity. And then once you got that trajectory going and you get arrested and you're in the system, it's not designed for you to get out.
Yeah.
And we just throw away the key. And so it's like no matter, even the people that did some of the most heinous crimes, they weren't bad people. You know, like they were just traumatized children that never like received the help that they needed.
Yeah.
And so even though the work was really powerful, I felt this calling to like do something that could potentially help people for more, like at a bigger scale than I ever could one-on-one.
Yeah.
And so it was like, I went back to school and it was like neuroscience. Like if I could just figure out what happens to the brain after trauma and fix it there before it festers and grows into a really deeply entrenched belief system and or, you know, psychiatric disorder, the impacts of that would be greater than anything I could do in my lifetime. And so that's sort of, that's basically what got me into neuroscience.
That's so cool. And fast forward to now, you're a father of a 3-year-old little girl who is precious.
Yeah.
How is it being a dad and a dad in recovery? And just, did you think life would be this way?
No. Yeah, it's amazing. It's the greatest thing that's ever happened to me, for sure. You know, I think there's so many moments now where, like, you know, for instance, I was at Disney on Ice, and I remember just watching her being so enamored by like Moana and just being like, probably smiling like a nerd and just being like, how did I get here?
Yeah.
You know, like I used to be like doing all kinds of degenerate things and like having this lifestyle, and now like I'm like driving her in a little remote control Land Rover and like walking a little Papillon. Like it's just so weird, you know?
Yeah.
But it's amazing. It's amazing, and it's obviously welcomed. And you know, I think back to like the day that she was born, and like or really before, like leading up to her birth, I was going through a lot internally, and like the way that I deal with that is I run, like not like literally, but not like figuratively. I
Not
guess.
away.
Yeah, like I do like cycling or running long distance, and I like randomly before she was born decided to run an ultra marathon.
Oh.
So I ran like it was a race from Crested Butte to Aspen, so it's like 40 miles, like 7,000 feet of climbing. And so I started training for this race. I was living in North Carolina at the time, and I was just like terrified that I was going to be a bad dad, you know. Like I was terrified that I didn't have what it took to be affectionate and be loving. And part of that's because I had spent my whole life sort of hiding behind these subconscious walls that I built to keep people away. I think like it's like between the deaths and like people sort of letting me down my whole life, the pain of the letdown or the loss put me in a place where it's like, well, I don't really want to let anybody in anymore because it hurts too much when they leave.
Yeah.
You know? So I had that, and then, you know, I had never really been, my dad, there was just so much going on early on between my parents and my mom moving me around and my dad not really being around early on that I never really, it was never modeled to me, like how to be a dad. So I just was afraid I was going to be a terrible dad, you know. And so I'll never forget, like, the day that she was born and that, you know, I was handed this little girl. And like something inside of me just cracked, you know, like I had never felt love like that before. And it's like terrifying to love something so much, you know, like it goes against my nature, right? Is to not let people in because of the fear of like being hurt. Well, here you don't have a choice.
Yeah.
You're on the hook and you love this thing more than you love yourself.
Yeah.
So hopefully nothing happens, you know, and
yeah.
like, and it's been amazing. And I think like, one of the gifts of recovery is that we we learn this like design for living. We get all these tools that allow us to navigate life with grace.
Yeah.
And instead of her having to figure that out the way that we did, she's sort of training in the arts, the Jedi, whatever, right? Like she's training in the work from the ground up.
Yeah.
And we talk about like when she's upset, what are you feel? What emotions are you feeling? Are you feeling sad? Are you feeling, just being able to identify an emotion, not be fully. It's like I'm angry, but I'm feeling angry.
Yeah.
I'm feeling anger.
Right.
And like what's going on, and like just talking about it, know, and giving her the tools to be able to deal with emotions, which is really the most important part when you're growing up. Like, because it's inevitable. Kids are savages, like there's gonna be bullying and there's gonna be people saying mean things, and so it's like, really, can I give my child a secure attachment style? Priority number one. I want to make sure my child knows that she's loved and that like it's a safe, like the world is safe.
Yeah.
Even if it's not fully safe, like fundamentally, you can't. It's like real hard, next to impossible, to reverse attachment styles. Usually, if you have an insecure attachment style, you'll spend the rest of your life working against it. Mm-hmm. But then the second one is like giving her the tools to be able to navigate her emotions and communicate about what's going on. So yeah, it's a crazy experience. Nobody does it perfectly, but especially as she gets older, it'll be really cool to continue to share some of these lessons. But then also like I feel bad because it's like been there, done that. Like it's gonna be pretty hard to get away with some things that maybe I got away with.
I know. Now I look back and I'm like, probably some of the most strict parents were like the crazier ones, you know, because they know all the secrets.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that is so amazing. And and this going back to when you're talking about being of service, like that's something I can say this because of yesterday, but that's something you've continued to do. Like yesterday you came out to Impact and you spoke to the guys and you told your story, and like you didn't have to do that. And I just love the process of recovery because like we want to do that kind of stuff now.
Yeah. And
how you're talking about just being useful. Like I heard a speaker tape one time say, addicts and alcoholics didn't know they needed to be useful until they are.
Right. And
like not wanted to, not cared about it, not try, like need it. Like we need it. But it turns into a want at the same time. Like it's, it's fun. Like I love going and sharing if I can and things like that. And so thank you for doing that and coming here and, sharing all the things. It's been great.
Yeah, no, it's been awesome. I appreciate the opportunity. It's just been great to reconnect and come out and see what you guys are doing out there. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else you want to add?
I don't think so. I think I guess what I would say is like, if you're struggling, I'm not being paid to come out here and pitch something to you. Like what I'm telling you is I had this experience and it worked for me, and there's ways to do this. As I said, you don't have to believe in God. Like there's all these ways to get through this process and find recovery, and even beyond 12 steps, there's options out there. So, if you're struggling, I hope that you give yourself a chance because you're worth it, and like what lies on the other end of like doing these things that are uncomfortable can completely change your life. And I feel like I'm a testament to that, and so are you.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Pretty amazing.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, thank you again.
Of course.
And thank you again for tuning in to another episode. I hope today's conversation has inspired you, maybe opened your mind, maybe even your heart. But remember, you're not alone. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with them. And don't forget to like and subscribe. I will have all the social links below. But until then, keep making an impact. Bye, y'all.